Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Autism Exploration Series. I'm Dr. Emily Sampone, the Director of Clinical Operations at Verbal Beginnings. Verbal Beginnings' mission is to change lives for our clients, families, and our professionals, and we do that through our pledge of care, which is our promise to you, to provide effective treatment through compassionate care. We also strive to achieve our mission through our core values, which one of our core values is education, teaching families valuable ways to work with your child. And that's why we decided to start this series. I also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce you to the services that we offer here at Verbal Beginnings. In addition to our in-home and center-based ABA services, we also offer center-based comprehensive services, feeding therapy, and social skills programming. Additionally, we encourage you to participate with us today throughout the presentation by using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captioning during this recording, which you can access by navigating to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, without further ado, I would love to introduce you to our presenters for the evening, Andrea Bennett and Lisa Frank.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Emily, so much for having us on today so we can do this presentation. Andrea, your camera's not on, so
I'm not, it went away when we started it, so I'm not really sure what happened. I didn't turn it off, but I don't know if it's because I'm sharing my screen or what, but I don't know why. Yeah.
I will keep going for the benefit of everybody. Just a little background about us. Andrea and I were special education teachers, I feel like a million years ago, 18, 20 years ago, and started the Special Kids Company and helping families kind of navigate the IEP process. Tonight's presentation really takes you through the IEP and kind of what you should expect, when you are going through this process. And hopefully, if you guys have questions, you can put them in the chat box or Emily can, chime in. But we basically wanted to go through this presentation with everyone to kind of show you how to navigate it on your own if you don't have someone like us, in the meetings with you. So I will tell you, this is our first Zoom presentation, and we are so not technically savvy, so bear with us as we kind of go through this.
Okay, so to get things started, there are a few acronyms if you haven't figured it out already. The special education process is, as many people like to refer to it, the Dr. Seuss, the alphabet soup. There are more acronyms than we could even begin to count, but here are a few really important ones that we think it's important for you to know. IDEA, which is the law that governs special education. It is a federal law, so every state at the federal level is required to adhere to IDEA. It's the Individuals with Disabilities Act. FAPE is what we call free and appropriate public education. An attorney that we work with once told us the biggest part of that is appropriate. And so sometimes as parents, it's natural to sit there and say, I want my kid to have the best education. I have kids, Lisa has kids. We fully understand that. The law does not say you are afforded the best, the very best. You are afforded what is appropriate. And what is appropriate is always up for debate. An IEP, some of you may have already been familiar with an IFSP, but the IEP is the plan, the Individualized Education Plan or program that children get when they start when they get to school age. And basically, you have to, if your child has special education services and they're in a public school, those public schools get funding through the IEP and IDEA. PWN is prior written notice. It's basically minutes. So when you have a meeting and they're taking notes, it's the minutes for that meeting. Now, every state and every local school system does it a little bit different. There are some school systems that the PWN really requires that what was considered, what was talked about, and did everyone agree to it or not? And if there was any disagreement in what was proposed, what were the options? So if you said, I want my kid to get 4 hours a week of ABA, and the school system said, no, we're going to give them 3. All of that has to be documented, and then they would have to state why they're only giving 3. The justification for why there was an agreement or a disagreement, more importantly. And last but not least is LRE, the least restrictive environment. IDEA is very clear that to the extent that it's appropriate and possible, children should be educated with their non-disabled peers. So they call that the least restrictive environment. So that may be in their home school, in their general education classroom, all day long with non-disabled peers. That's the least restrictive. But for some kids, that's not appropriate. And so they may be in their home school, but maybe they're getting reading out away from their non-disabled peers for so many hours a week. That's still the least restrictive environment for that particular student. Not all LREs are the same for every kid. It depends on what their individual needs are. So these are just some acronyms that you're going to hear a lot throughout the entire process. It's good to know what they are as you navigate it. Speaking of process.
This is our special education process that we've kind of outlined and we'll go back to several times this evening. And just kind of like remembering that the special education process is a full circle and it keeps going year after year after year while you're in the special education process. So, first we're identifying, your child's needs. That's, being done through formal evaluations. Then you have to determine eligibility. From there, if they're eligible, you develop an IEP. From there, we have to implement the IEP. After that, we want to monitor progress to make sure that we are showing progress. And then your annual review, which happens every year, comes along and you determine if they have made progress, if they haven't made progress, what needs to be changed. And sometimes that's done kind of through this reevaluation process, and then the circle starts again. So it's a continuum all year after year after year. And so we'll go through this slide a little bit more.
This right here is the basis of this presentation. All of these components are what we're going to be talking about. And the biggest thing to take away from this is the word process. It's a process, not an event. So nothing happens in a vacuum, and nothing unfortunately happens overnight. It's a time thing, and it often takes a lot of time. So starting the IEP process, Lise.
So identifying needs, right? Number one, we just saw that in our circle. The initial IEP meeting has to be within 30 days. Best way to do this for everybody out there, because I know, you might want to pick up the phone and call, is to put your request in writing. That way they can say, they never, a lot of times they'll say they didn't get it, or we didn't know that's what you were, wanting, or we didn't know you wanted to start the timeline. Make sure it's a written request. And questions that I think you want to ask, like, hi, I'd like to start the initial IEP meeting process by way of this email. I would like it to be, within the next 30 days. What data would I need? Here are the areas of concern. And these are the things that I suspect are a disability, or, my child already has a disability, and, you're documenting that.
You can also send, sorry, Lisa, you can also send, so if let's say you've been to Kennedy Krieger or Johns Hopkins or Mount Washington or some other institution, and you've received an autism diagnosis, for example, and you've got this 30-page report, you can say, here is the report from Dr. So-and-so at so-and-so, where my child was identified as a student, as a child with autism. And then I would like to request an IEP meeting to go over these results and talk more about it.
And along those lines, I think it's important to remember that, school systems have to review any outside assessments. I mean, that you give them, right? If you determine that you want to give them. So, just because you have a process going on with Verbal Beginnings doesn't mean that the information from Verbal Beginnings can't be shared with the school IEP team. I encourage that you share all of that with the school IEP team. Okay, so within 60 days of the initial IEP meeting, right, you have to have a completion of assessments and the second IEP meeting to determine eligibility. So meeting number one, you're going in, you're presenting all your information. They're going to go over all your documents. Here's what they have. And at that point, they can say, yes, we think we have enough information to determine eligibility, or nope, we still have a lot of outstanding questions. And we think that there's more, information that we need. That's the likely of the two, that they'll want more information. And so, which is fine, they'll ask for you to consent to assessments at that meeting. No assessments are done unless you give consent. Or you could say, fine, we'll have these assessments done on our own and we'll bring them back to the IEP meeting. Doesn't matter if you do them privately or with the school system. And then you would have another meeting after that to determine the eligibility. So
The school system is
eligibility,
required to do it for free, though, by the way. If they're offering to do assessments, that is free of charge to you.
yes.
Privately, you have to pay for those.
When looking at determination or eligibility of determination, which we're going to get to in another slide, I won't go through that yet. Within 30 days of the eligibility meeting, right, then another IEP meeting has to be held to develop the IEP. So it's a total of 90 days that this can go on. And that's, barring snow and, any other event, your family getting sick, it in a minimum, it will take 90 days. They are under a timeline, so they want it to be done in that time, 90 days, which is great because I always think that helps and benefits families to do it quicker rather than not. But again, it's a process. Additional important timelines. So the notice of the IEP meeting, this is a big one, received 10 calendar days prior, meaning that a school can't just call you and be like, hey, we want to have a meeting tomorrow. Or it's a Friday and they're like, hey, we meant to tell you that we scheduled a meeting for Monday. They have to give you 10 calendar days. We all work, we all have busy schedules. So they have to give you notice 10 calendar days prior. And it's okay to say that date doesn't work. I find that the school systems now are just like sending a date and a time and like, hey, you should be here. And families, can look at their calendars and say, I can't be there at that time. I have another kid that I, have to get on the bus at 7:30, so I can't make a 7:45 meeting. Or I can't do a 1 o'clock meeting in the middle of the day because I can't leave my job. All kinds of reasons. It's okay to say no and reschedule.
You can also, in your initial written request for the meeting, you can say, here's information, and I'm going to have an IEP meeting. Here are 5 dates that work for me and my family.
I always think that's
front.
helpful. Yep.
Yeah.
I always think that's helpful because then they're going to work around your dates.
Yeah.
Okay. And then 5 days before the meeting, you should receive anything that's going to be discussed at that meeting, an IEP, any data that was collected, teacher reports. I was in a meeting today and the IEP chair is reading all about the teacher reports. I'm like, did we get those? Nope, didn't get them. You need those before. You want to have time to digest it and read it, ask questions. So you want to make sure you're getting everything 5 business days before the scheduled meeting. And if you're not, feel free to email them and just say, hey, I haven't received anything. And then 5 days after the IEP meeting, they were required to give you the IEP and the PWN, right? The minutes from the meeting, any documents that were discussed and took place during that meeting.
And those last 3 important timelines obviously are, if you, especially the letter C, and is if you actually qualify for, once you're at that IEP process point. So in the very beginning, when you're just doing determining of eligibility, you're obviously not going to get an IEP after that first meeting, but you should get a PWN or minutes from that meeting. Anything that was discussed should be sent to you afterwards.
Always a PWN after every meeting.
Yep. So we've identified the needs. That's the first part. You just have to go to that school, sit down and say, what are our needs? You can bring what identified needs you have from your private, providers, if that's the case, from Verbal Beginnings, from your speech pathologist, if you have a private speech pathologist or occupational therapist, you bring all that to the table and say, here's what we've identified. And the school may say, okay, as Lisa said, and go along with that. Or they may say, well, it doesn't look like a formal speech evaluation has been done, or we need more information about speech or occupational therapy or
an assistive tech evaluation, whatever it is.
Right. They
Physical
generally
therapy.
want to do some type of an observation, and which is good. Like I wouldn't want somebody creating a program for my child that they've never seen. So usually it is common for them to want to do some type of an observation, perhaps of your child at Verbal Beginnings or at their preschool or wherever they may be attending right now as part of this formal evaluation. And so when Lisa was talking about the assessments and evaluations that are used to help the identification process. So you've identified the needs. Now, what do we do to solidify that?
So the assessments and evaluations, again, are helping the team understand your child's strengths, needs, learning styles, and the very important present levels of performance, right? That's your baseline. Where are they starting? Because remember, the IEP, which you're reviewing every year, is going to eventually, we're going to talk about goals and objectives, and you need a good baseline, so you know where you're starting and kind of where you're going to finish. How do we do that? All right. So we talk about different assessments and evaluations. We've listed here a ton. The first bullet really are your formal assessments. So those are standardized assessments, meaning those are being compared to the same age as your child. And they're normed across the country, right? So that's what a standardized assessment means. There's an educational, there's a cognitive, we know that there's adaptive scales, there's behavior rating scales, there's speech and language, there's occupational therapy. Everyone has their own area of formal assessments that usually they would propose doing.
These are just examples. This is not an exhaustive list. So
Not
these
even close to an exhaustive list.
not even close. These are just some of the more common ones you may hear, but there are certainly plenty others that they may want to use.
And so along with that, they also can use what we call informal assessments. And again, Andrea and I always believe that formal assessments, informal assessments, and I think you can see in our little triangle, you really want to have at least 3 sources when you're kind of creating a baseline. So the informal assessments, anything they're doing in the classroom, every school system has end of unit assessments, state assessments, county assessments, benchmark assessments. They're doing the MCAP, which is the state. Some of them are doing iReady, which is a computer-based assessment. The MAP is a computer-based assessment. So tons of informal information. Lots of times I see parents and they bring me their IEPs and it's only formal assessments. And I'm like, well, what's going on like on a day-to-day basis, right? What's happening in the classroom every day? That should be also part of, the assessment and evaluation piece. Anything that they're doing in response to intervention, meaning they've identified that, your child has a reading issue, but it's not necessarily special education yet, but they're collecting data to see if they're going to put in, some kind of 6-week program and if they can show progress on that. That's response to intervention. Obviously the
Anything
report.
Verbal Beginnings, like any data from Verbal Beginnings, if your child's attending there, or if you have a private tutor that you're having work with your kiddo, all of that is still important data.
The report card information, we have teacher progress notes. Remember, you should be getting those 4 times a year if you are in the special education process. And then, of course, any other evaluations provided by parents, your pediatrician, your psychiatrist, your therapist, like Andrea said, a tutor, all of that, if anyone wants to write a letter and, make sure it's signed and dated, but all that's important. And also classroom observations. So you going in and doing an observation, having someone from your outside provider do an observation, all of that should be looked at when you're looking at assessments and evaluations.
So when we say 3 sources, we don't mean just 3 standardized sources. We mean 3 different types of sources. Your standardized, your non-standardized, at home, school-based, the more the better. Okay, so
to our little circle here.
Yep.
Next would be determine eligibility.
So now you've had all this information. You bring all of this, you come back to the table. Remember that when we talked about the timeline, your initial meeting, the 30 day, within 30 days, that's when they're just sitting there saying, what data do we need to determine, to identify the needs? We do the formal evaluations. You come back to the table now within those 60 days to share all of that information, all of that data from the previous slide. And these are the questions that you have to ask and consider, you being the team, you and the school-based team, in order, because you can't have an IEP if you don't have an educationally based disability. I think that's really important to note, because you can have a disability, but if it's not shown or proven, or if the data doesn't show that that disability impacts you from the educational standpoint, then you would not qualify for an IEP. So these are 3 critical questions that the team has to answer in order to get that. So we'll talk about the 15 different categories. Again, it's IDEA is a federal thing, so they lump a lot of them together. We'll talk about that on the next slide, but there's 15 categories that are there to choose from.
That a student can qualify
Right,
for
exactly.
special education.
Right. The second one is what I was talking about. So you can have a disability, but it has to adversely affect your child's performance. So it has to have a significant impact. If the kiddo is a little bit delayed in reading, but not significant, they may not qualify. There has to be a significant impact. How big is that gap between, especially for little guys, when we're talking about developmental delay, this is where the more information, the better, because sometimes just one little piece may seem like there's not that much of an impact, or the delay isn't that big. But when you start pulling in perhaps speech and language evaluations and some behavior rating scales on top of that, then we see that the impact is greater than maybe just one standardized score on a Woodcock-Johnson, for example, or one of the educational assessments. So it has to be impacting them educationally and their ability to make progress there. And then therefore,
quickly, just so we're clear, it's important to remember that we're talking about the whole child, because so many school systems want to just say, well, there's no academic, gap, but behaviorally there's a big gap, maturity wise there's a big gap, speech and language there's a big gap. That also qualifies. It's not just reading, writing, and math.
right?
Sorry,
Because all those pieces impact education. If you can't sit in a circle and collaborate with your friends and your peers when they're working together and they're doing these,
that's an impact.
that's all part of the educational impact. So and then the third one is, does it require the provision of special education services? So even if there's an impact, is it so significant, this is what I was talking about, that it requires specially designed instruction? So do they need something that's different than what everyone else is getting in the classroom? That can be through a specialized program. That could be through like a research-based program. That could be like ABA, for example, if they need something of that nature in order to help them maintain their behavior so that they can stay in the classroom, for example. That's all specially designed instruction for this kiddo, something that the rest of the class is not getting and does not require. Okay, the 15 codes.
These are them. I don't think we need to go through all of them. I think it's pretty clear, where these codings are going from. The only one that I would really, make sure you focus in on, for something like other health impairment, that's where, your ADHD is falling under. We're seeing a ton of kids with anxiety. I'm putting that under there.
But that could also go under, you have to be careful, because sometimes that could go under emotional disability, which we really try to
steer,
especially when they're so little. I mean,
Yeah.
they're so little. But I think the biggest thing with this slide to remember is that they have to lump some of them together. So specific learning disability, that's dyslexia, that's dysgraphia, that's,
Yes.
they will put a lot of these together in that one, because they can't list every single disability out. There would be too many to count.
And the other thing is that when they're looking at these codings, so let's say you have ADHD, a specific learning disability, and autism, okay? What they're looking at, and what the team should be looking at, is which disability is most prevalent, is the one that's primarily impacting your child. So it doesn't mean that if you pick specific learning disability and they have autism and they have ADHD, that we can't address that in the IEP. It just means it won't be the primary coding, but there's other places in the IEP to spell out everything else. So don't worry.
Don't worry about it. Right. Exactly. It's not a do or die. The important thing is to make sure that all of them get documented within the IEP, and you can ask that question specifically. So if they say we're going to code your child with autism, then you can say, where in the IEP are we going to document the specific learning disability and the ADHD?
And usually it's in the eligibility section. The other thing I just want to mention for a lot of you, because you have really young kids, is developmental delay. And that's kind of like a catch-all term when a team doesn't feel like they really know, or can parse out, which thing is impacting, them the most. And that's fine to do developmental delay. The law says by your 8th birthday, you have to come up with one of the other primary coding. So it's
a lot of kiddos, we do that because we don't necessarily, and sometimes kids are coded with developmental delay at 4 or 5, and then they don't need an IEP. They get services, really intensive services, and then they test out and they're no longer require the provisions of special education. I mean, that would be the ultimate, if we can catch them early and get them the early intervention, that they don't even need it. And so then they move on. Speaking of moving on,
I did get a question that I think would be relevant to that slide, if you don't mind.
Oh, good. Yes, chime in.
Okay, question is, what would be an example of a type of disability that would not qualify?
Like a medical disability?
Well, it's not even a type of a disability. It's about whether or not you have to go back to the 3 questions of, does it substantially impact their, I mean, here's one. You could
And
have
what specialized instruction would it need?
Right. So think about maybe an orthopedic impairment would be a potential, but even then, because then they have PE, and so they may need specialized instruction for adaptive physical education. So I don't want to say that there's any disability that would automatically rule that out. The question is, does that disability impact them from accessing their curriculum, and do they need specially designed instruction? That's really the key. It's not about what the disability is, it's the impact of the disability.
For instance, we hear all the time, right, that we'll review like a OT, an occupational therapy assessment from an outside provider. And the outside provider is like, oh, they need to be working on, push-ups and gross motor skills and, things to strengthen their trunk. School systems are like, that's not really impacting him in school, right? He may have low tone and trunk issues, but that's not impacting him in school. So unless you can show the impact and what specialized instruction they need, that's the fight.
Right. I've had kids with autism that did not qualify for that did not need an IEP. So it really, did not qualify for an IEP. Okay. Once we've determined eligibility, we have our coding, then we get into the development of the IEP. This could be a whole session in and of itself, so bear with us. We're trying not to go too fast, and just know that if there are questions at the end, which there very may will be, that we can't get to, feel free to email. We'll provide our contact information. You can email us separately, but the IEP in and of itself is a major, it could literally be 2 hours long. So development of the IEP. What is an IEP?
Yep. And so it's important to remember this is the most important document. It's why we spend so much time on it. And it's part of the, IDA that provides federal funds to the state or the local agency to make sure that special education and related services are being given to children with disabilities. So an IEP is for anyone 3 through 21. You have an IFSP, which is just the family plan before 3 if needed. And it identifies a disability, one of the 15 federally mandated codes that we just went over. And the purpose of it is to require the provision of specially designed instruction. Again, what does your child need differently and how to be taught differently in order to make progress, on state standards, and to close the gap between, your student or your child and their peers. So
instruction is the key
in a
point with
nutshell.
an IEP. And instruction is the key point in that, because there's something called a 504, which that's not what this is about, but that is a a federally mandated document as well, but there's no, it's not really about specially designed instruction for the IEP is really about instruction. Okay.
Go
These
for
are
it.
all the key components of an IEP, and this is why the IEP itself could be 2 hours long of a presentation. I know everyone on this call is smart enough that they can read this. I'm not going to read this to you, but it is important to note that the sections of the IEP, or the key pieces, primary disability, as we talked about, you're going to have one that you have to put there, but then you can list on the secondary pages all of the other disabilities that your child may have and how they impact. That's all going to be under eligibility eligibility pages. Then we talk about the state. For the little guys, this is not critically important because they're so little, but they are going to have to take statewide assessments. They're not doing that when they're in kindergarten. But there's a section there that says when they get to that age, will they take, in Maryland, it's, the high school assessments, the MCAP, all the state assessments that are required. So every state has their individual state requirements, and I'm sure Virginia and Delaware and Pennsylvania, you probably familiar with them. There's generally a section on the IEP that just check boxes that they're going to participate in those if they're of age to participate in them. The next one is the present levels. That's really important. So each section of the area that's impacted. So if you have a speech deficit, if you have occupational therapy, fine motor, all your academic areas, if there's reading and writing deficits, they each get their own section of present level where you will put all of that data that you gathered earlier on that we talked about. So all your standardized data would go under that present level, as well as your informal data should go there. So make sure that that's as comprehensive as possible, because that drives the rest of the programming. If your present levels are not strong and comprehensive, it makes the argument perhaps down the road for goals and objectives and services harder to make if you haven't documented the need in that present level. So if the child's functioning 3 years below grade level, that's where you put that.
And again, we harp on this because so many times I'll see an IEP and the present levels just give me some numbers from a statewide assessment or a formal assessment. And it really is not telling you, what's happening on a day-to-day basis, or what's happening in a classroom, what's happening at home. So as specific as you can be, and inclusive of all of that information is super important.
Yes, especially for your initial one, because then you'll have that to build off of for subsequent IEPs as you go forward. Parental input. This is the section that, and I always tell parents, this is where you can put whatever you want. You can say that you want your child to go to school on the moon, and they have to put that in there. Doesn't mean they're going to do it, but this is your moment as a parent to say, what are you most happy about the child's progress? What are your biggest fears about your child's progress? What are you most concerned about? What do you see as the most, the biggest area of need? It's your parental input. Lisa and I encourage parents oftentimes to type it up, because sometimes it's easier than when you try to get to a meeting and you say to them, I have my parental input. I've typed it up for you. I'll email it, and they can just cut and paste it right into the document.
Yep. If you don't, then sometimes they interpret what you're saying in the meeting and take their own minutes of what they think you're saying. And then parents are upset. They're like, oh, they missed this and this. Honestly, type it up.
Yes.
Make sure your voice is heard. This is your place, to put all your hopes, your dreams, what you're mad about, what you want the school to be doing. So yeah, worth your time every year to really make sure your parental input is typed up and ready to go.
And along that, on the same page, they also talk about how the child's disability impacts their ability to participate with the general education curriculum. And so if you have a case where you have your child that has 3 different disabilities, separate those out. We'll say, Sally's autism impacts her ability in the classroom to communicate effectively with her peers, deal with unexpected changes in the schedule, integrate the sensory stimulation around her, whatever it is. The next one, Sally's reading disability, specific learning disability in reading impacts her ability to decode single words or to comprehend sentences, text longer than a sentence. Break each of those disabilities down and put that in the impact statement for that. Testing accommodations, those are state, district, classroom, anything that's a test. Those are usually a checkbox. And that could, again, the list is extensive. And along that is the supplementary aids and accommodations. Sometimes there's overlap there and it can be confusing for parents because there is a lot of overlap. The state testing accommodations tend to be a little more restrictive than the supplementary aid. You can be more broad, more specific to your child when you're thinking about things that you need for the supplementary aids and services. So you can say things like, Sally needs a wedge cushion as a sensory tool.
A feeding plan,
Right.
a different writing, tool, a slant board, boundaries when she's on the carpet. I mean, this is where you want to lay out, all the concerns. And again, medical, this is also another place you could be putting that, toileting, feeding, any kind of self, life skills. You can put that in this section.
Training for teachers. So if your child's getting ABA or has been getting ABA and now, maybe you're weaning it off there, but you still want to make sure those principles of ABA are used in the classroom. You can put in there staff trained on the principles of ABA as part of that, or staff trained on a feeding protocol. So there's places for staff training.
Or if you need a BCBA, that's
Right.
where I put it too, right? Sally requires a BCBA to come into the classroom 1 time a week.
Yep.
That's where you're putting all that.
Okay, then the next one is the transition requirements. That's another section, but that doesn't really apply to most of the people on this call. I would assume once you get to age 14, then we start thinking about, they're part of the process and what we're going to do as they get older. Measurable goals and objectives, and these are huge. So that present levels of information that we talked about, present levels of performance in the beginning, you take that now, and then those become your goals and objectives. So if in reading, they're 2 years below and they can't identify any of the letters of the alphabet, you're going to have a goal in reading, perhaps, that says and we'll get into what those goals and objectives could look like, but by the end of the year, Sally's going to, identify all upper and lowercase letters of the alphabet. So each of those present levels should have, if it identified that they are areas of need that require specialized instruction, should have goals and objectives
To go with it
further on into the IEP. There's something called ESY. Don't confuse it with summer school. Most counties and school systems have what summer school. This is different. This ESY is for students with special needs only. Summer school sometimes is offered to kids who may be at risk, and school systems will identify those kiddos and offer summer school to them. ESY is through the provisions of special education services. And so that is different. And there has to be, as a checklist in your first IEP, you're not going to go, they'll defer it generally, because if they haven't had it, they have to show that they haven't made progress. That's one of the things that they're looking for, or that the progress has been so great that if they stop, that there'll be some regression over the summertime. So there's a whole page of different criteria. It has to be a life skill that the child, that's the first question, and reading is a life skill. Don't let anybody tell you that it's not. Just like toileting and feeding are life skills, so are academic areas. Then you get into the hours of service, and then finally placement, which we talked about, LRA. Again, there's a lot to this. There's more to this, but those are the key pieces that you'll see in every IEP that are identified on this slide here, which is why IEPs are 60 pages long.
Right. And one thing, that I find is that we spend so much time on all these pieces, and then we'll get to an IEP meeting and like the last 3 minutes, they want to throw out hours and placement. Those are really big conversations. Feel free to be like, my head is spinning and I don't think we have enough time to go over the hours of special education. By the way, you've most likely been waiting this entire time to get to the hours of special education. So it's important to make sure you understand it and ask your questions. Where would that happen? Who would be doing it? It says a paraeducator could do it. Does that mean it's not going to be a special education teacher? Is it going to be an aid? Like all these questions, you know, that you may be thinking about, take the time to ask them. That's an important section.
And just so you know, because a lot of times school systems don't tell you this, the services and LRE or placement are not supposed to be sent home ahead of time. So when they send you the draft IEP, you will have all of those pieces except for services and placement, and that's they're not supposed to. I tell parents will say, well, great, this is all fine, but how are they going to do it? That's what's really supposed to be discussed at the meeting. So school systems aren't supposed to send those
And
pieces.
just real quickly, the reason why they're not supposed to send it is because it should be an IEP team decision, what services and where the IEP will be implemented. If they're sending it home and they're like, oh, it's going to be in this school and only this school, it's called determining placement, which is, you know, unlawful basically.
Predetermining, right.
Right, predetermining a placement. You can't, you know, they can't do that. You are a part of the IEP process and the IEP team. So they don't send those home. They shouldn't send them home.
Right. But
All
have the
right.
questions in your head. So when you go to the meeting, and once they send you all those goals and objectives and the supplementary aids and all of this stuff, be thinking in your head, how many hours a week are they going to need? We'll talk more about that. How many hours a week are they going to, you know, see my kiddo in speech in order to achieve these 4 goals that they sent home to me ahead of time?
And who's really the person doing it and how are they tracking it and all the things you'll have questions about.
Right.
Okay, so the IEP goals and objectives, again, as we've said, I feel like using the present levels of performance, your baseline information, that's how you're going to write appropriate goals and objectives. And you're not writing them, the school's going to be writing them and sending them home to you. And I think the thing that you want to really look at, I mean, first of all, just read it and be like, I have no idea how this could possibly be measurable or observed, right? I have no idea how a school would do that. Feel free to ask that. You don't have to just be like, oh, these sound like really good goals. If you don't understand it, most likely everyone else at the table doesn't understand it either. Maybe just the teacher that wrote it understood it in her head. But it's okay to clarify. And so what you want to do is make sure that they are observable, right? A behavior that you can actually see them doing, right? That they're reading certain words, that they're writing certain words, that they are attending to a lesson, not just, you know, looking off into space and thinking that they're attending to a lesson, showing a behavior that they're actually attending. And
What we
then
call that,
measure,
Lisa? What was it? It was the dead man's test.
right? If a dead man can't do it,
If a dead man can do it, then it's not observable. Johnny will sit there on 4 out of 5 occasions.
yep.
That's not telling me what I want them to do. When they're attending, what are they doing that's letting me know they're attending? Are they
They're
raising
raising,
their hand?
they're raising their hand, they're asking a question,
Looking at the book?
they're participating in idea, they're coloring in or following along on the calendar, whatever it is. And then the measurement, you know, how it's going to be evaluated in trials, in occurrences, in accuracy, you know, all of those need to be attached to each goal and each objective.
A big one there, and this one can be tricky because you'll see things like, especially when they get older, will write something or do it with 45% accuracy or 82%, 80% accuracy. So say to them, okay, 80% accuracy. Well, what does that mean?
What would
80%,
that look like? Can you give
is
me an
that
example
80%
of
of
what?
the time? Right. Is it 80% of the time? That's different than accuracy. Measuring attending 80% accuracy is very difficult. They're either attending or they're not on 4 out of 5 trials, which would be 80% of the time. So
And a lot of you guys are coming from, you know, a place that collects amazing data, right? You're getting data all the time. It's being tracked all the time. It's definitely different once you get into the school system. But there is a way when you're writing the goals and objectives to try to make it as measurable as possible. So that gives you the information that you're seeking.
exactly. And it should be, don't let them undershoot it either. Think about the present level. So if they're already reading 20 out of 26 letters of the alphabet or identifying 20 out of 26 letters of the alphabet and they're only expecting them to get 6 in an entire year.
Right. And I don't know if we said that. The goals and objectives are written for 1 year's time, not for like what's going to happen in 2 years or 6 months. They're writing them for 1 year's time. So what can you expect in that time for them to make progress.
Okay. So based on all the goals and objectives, and there is no rule book for this, but what you have
We're
to
trying.
do, we're trying. So based on the number of goals and how complex they are, then you have to figure out how much time is required in order to make reasonable progress or achieve. You want to achieve that goal at the end of the year. Again, there's no rule book that says if there's 3 math goals that they get X number of hours per week. It just doesn't work like that. So you, as a team, you have to have that discussion, and some questions that you can ask about that help guide that a little bit are, is this going to be done in the general education classroom, or is this pull out? Because if it's one-on-one, sometimes you can get more done in less time because it's more intensive, versus if it's going to be done in the classroom in a group of 10 kids, they may need to be seen more frequently because they're not going to get as much individualized attention to achieve that goal. How big is the gap? How much further do we have to go? And so if the gap is really big, you want more intensity and more services to try and close that gap. That is the goal of special education. The goal of special education services is to close the gap between peers, their non-disabled peers, and peers with disabilities. So I always say, what are we doing to close the gap? How close are we getting to close that gap? And so you'll get into how many hours a week, and so there's how many hours a week, and then get into speech and language and OT. They're the related services. A lot of times they do it per year or per month, not per year, but they'll do it monthly. I think a lot of that has to do with the medical and their reporting, how they have to record it. So if they say to you, well, I'm going to offer it 4 times a month, you can say, so is that weekly? Is that 30 minutes a week? What does that look like? Because it's okay to ask that, even though it may not be written that way on your IEP. Again, some school systems and states do it differently, particularly for your related services providers. So ask the questions. So are you going to see my kid once a week? Is it going to be in your office one-on-one in a quiet space? Is it going to be in a group of 3? Are you going into the classroom? Are you going into the lunchroom? Where are these things happening?
Right. And you have a right to know, those things, and how the services are being provided. I find that they're becoming more and more vague about it. So, this, again, just keep asking questions. And the other thing is, if you feel like they need, 30 minutes a day of reading, and they're like, well, we only think they need 10 minutes a day, then it's okay to say, I think he needs 30 minutes. I'm willing to let him try 10 minutes a day. Let's come back in 45 days and review how those 10 minutes are going. Right. And so, and remember, you can call an IEP meeting at any time. It's pretty rare, if you think your child isn't making progress, do not wait a year. You can have a 45-day review, you can have a 60-day review, you could have a mid-year review. So don't be afraid to call IEP meetings and ask and talk about, if you think the services are adequate or not.
And actually, I would encourage anybody who's going with the IEP for the very first time with your public school to do that. When you have that meeting and you qualify for an IEP and you finally finalize it, that was a redundancy. Say to the team, I would like to schedule a 45-day review to come back to the table and see how things are going, because it's the first time being implemented, and there may be things that we didn't put on here that we needed to put on. So they have to come back at least once a year, but you can call it more frequently if you need to, as the school team can as well. Okay. Services drive placement.
So least restrictive environment, we talked about where everyone's beginning is, although it's not the same for everybody, but the school system wants to believe, that every child's least restrictive environment is in their home school in the general education setting. I think the best acronym, and why this picture is here, is to understand that special education is a continuum of services. So we like to kind of look at a long hallway and talk about that all the doors to the left and the right are different ways to get more services and where they're going to be. And so moving along that continuum from 0 services, which is right off the elevator, right? And then, shutting doors along the way if you need more services. The last door at the very end is the most restrictive environment, right? Whatever that is for your student, a non-public placement, a residential placement, a therapeutic day placement, whatever that is. But you don't go from zero to, that last door. You are working along the continuum if your child needs more services along the way. And that's really kind of how you have to work through the doors to with the IEP and building the IEP to make sure that, all of the needs are being met.
And that
And
doesn't mean that you have to go in each room of those doors. You have to consider it. You have to look at the number on the door and say,
that would be
10
appropriate or
hours a
wouldn't be
week.
appropriate.
Right, exactly. That doesn't mean you have to place your child in that setting to prove that it doesn't work. Sometimes you do, but it doesn't necessarily, based on as a team, you sit there and say, listen, they can do science and social studies and related arts and lunch and recess with their non-disabled peers with some support. So that's, we can just go down door 1 or door 2. One of those might be more appropriate for us.
What you don't usually do is go from zero to the end, right?
Yeah.
And the provision of special education services and IDA don't want you to do that because, then you're moving further and further away from what they believe, your least restrictive environment should be. So, keep that in mind. Again, this is part of the process. LRE is, an important piece and has to be well documented. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to ask to go see it. Don't be afraid to say, like, I have no idea what you're even proposing. I can't picture it. I've never seen that school. I've never seen that door. I've never seen that classroom. It's okay to say, we need to end the meeting. I want to go see it, and let's come back and discuss, if it would be appropriate or not.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I tell people I don't put my dog in a kennel without seeing it. I'm not going to place my child in a school or a classroom without seeing it. And you as
Just
a parent,
because you recommended it. And
right,
remember, lots of times they're recommending something they've never seen.
right,
So, do your due diligence.
right. And
Okay.
you as a parent, the law says you are an equal
Equal.
participant in the team. And so if you're sitting down at the table and they have all the information and you don't have it, that's not an equal participant. So you can say to them, in order for me to be an equal participant in this process, I need to have the same information you have. And so I need to go see this school. Okay. That's the IEP document in itself in a really quick nutshell. So now you have the IEP. You've got your LRE, you're doing some inside general education, and maybe you're doing some outside of general education. Now you have to implement it. As we talked about, any IEP, you're going to want to put it in place and see how it's going. So we have all this wonderful document, all these beautiful words, put it into action and see how it's playing out. How do we do that? How do we implement it? How long do we do it? First one, you want to do at least 45 days before you come back to the table. And you're going to be doing that through your monitoring of progress and your data collection.
So when you have an IEP, 4 times a year, you get a report card, and 4 times a year, you get an IEP progress report. I will tell you that lots of families don't know these IEP progress reports are coming home. And if they aren't, feel free to email the school. A good benchmark is every time you get a report card, you should be getting an IEP progress report. So there's data on all the IEP goals that they've been working on. If you're not getting it, ask for it. It's super important. And it'll tell you, is your child making progress? Are they not making progress? Most times it'll say making sufficient progress to meet the goal, but feel free to read the fine print in there. And, he went from 0 to 5% and we're a quarter in. That's
And
not
the
really
goal is
making
80%.
progress. Yeah. Yeah. And then say, I'd like to call an IEP meeting. Like, I don't think 5% on, this goal is really making sufficient progress. These are important documents. They're important documents as your kids get older. They're important documents to make sure that you have the documentation down the line if things go wrong or you really are upset with your school. All this data is super important, so you want to make sure it's correct. Look at your progress reports each quarter. Look at the goals and objectives. Look at them and go, was that really progress? Are they really making progress?
And is it specific to the criteria? So if the goal says that they're going to read 26 out of 26 letters of the alphabet, and the progress report says Sally read the book See Spot Run with
Right.
help. Okay,
What does that
that's
have to do
great.
with the
But
26
what does that have to
letters?
do with the 26 letters? Make sure that the progress they're reporting on matches what the skill that we are addressing in the goal and objective. We get that a lot of times. This quarter, we worked on adding. Okay, well, the math goal talks about subtracting. So, okay, next slide. Sorry, we are running short on time.
Always. Sorry, there's so much. So
So,
the cycle,
yeah,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The cycle, you know, as we talked about, right? It's this cycle that's going to continue. You know, you're going to have your annual review. It has to happen at least one time per year. It has to be prior to the date. You know, usually they'll schedule it for like a day or two of the, you know, a year later. And you're starting the whole process again. Now, you don't have to maybe do formal assessments, but they still need to be collecting informal assessments and classroom data and, you know, whatever computer assessments and benchmarks. Those you're going to use to then update, make sure you have new present levels, make sure you have new goals and objectives, talk about services. Just because they had the services from the year before doesn't mean they're going to have the same services the next year. And same with the LRA. I mean, it could be that things are changing, that, you know, they need a more restrictive environment, or maybe they're in a more restrictive environment and they need a lesser restrictive environment. So that changes every year. And then that last little bullet talks about that there should be a reevaluation at least every 3 years. The team has to at least hold a meeting every 3 years to talk about any identified areas of concern, and if the student is still, you know, eligible for whatever special education services and specialized instruction. So that has to happen every 3 years as well.
Right. And you again can bring in private assessments if that's what you need at any point. Let's say you're 2 years in and you went and had a private speech and language evaluation. You can come in at 2 years and say you want to have an IEP meeting, and it'll be a reevaluation meeting as well. But every 3 years, it has to be done at least. Okay, just a couple quick points to consider before we close out here. Document, document, document. If it's not written, it never happened down. We always go under the assumption that things are going to go wonderfully and splendid, and you're going to have a great transition or year with your school, and there's not going to be any issues. However, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So you want to document everything. With that said, you have to remember, heaven forbid things take a bad turn at any point and you were to have to hire an attorney, for example. Everything you say, everything you write down is not invisible. The school systems attorney would see that. So if you were to write an email and say, Mrs. Smith is the worst teacher on the planet, and I never want my kid to have anything to do with her, and I'm, you know, no matter what, I'm not gonna let Johnny do well in her class, or whatever it is, that's going to be
that can be discoverable.
Yes. So you want to record any requests that you're making, any disagreements that you have, put those in writing so that you have a record of it. But choose your words very carefully. And obviously, we always want to be respectful, be a strong advocate, but be professional and be respectful. Organize
and keep everything.
Yeah. Organize.
I mean, most schools are sending everything through, you know, PDFs electronically, which is great because if you ever needed it, you can go back and look at it. But yeah, I mean, you want to make sure, again, you have your PWN after 5 days of the meeting, or an IEP after 5 days of the meeting. You want to make sure that they invited, you know, who was invited to the meeting. You would get that 10 days in advance. Who the people are coming, you know, to that meeting that you've never seen before. Their names have to be listed. So these are all documents. There's a lot of them, I'll be honest. Just keep them all. Put them in a folder, put them, you know, this happened during the 22-23 school year, or the 24-25 school year, or grade 1 or grade 2. It's an easy way to keep it organized, but try to keep all of your documents.
Right. And lastly, thank you notes.
Yes.
I strongly encourage parents to, when you have a good experience, write a thank you note. to a teacher or a team member, for being
Whatever.
helpful, kind, whatever it is. If you're having in-person meetings, donuts go a long way. Bring in some snacks, whatever you want to. It can be a very stressful process, and teams do tend to go fast because that's what they do all day long. Don't be afraid to say, I don't understand. Can you please slow this down? Or if they booked an hour for the meeting and you do the first one, and you realize it's not enough time for the next one, you say, hey, can we make it an hour and a half? Bring a grandmother, bring a neighbor, have someone else with you at the table because it's a lot of information. And I always feel like it's good to have a second set of ears to say, it's kind of like when you go to the doctor and you want to, did you hear what I heard? Is that the same thing? So there's
And
no,
now you can record your meetings.
right. You can also
As long
record,
as
but you
you
have to
give
let
them,
them know ahead.
as long as you give them advance warning, you can record your meetings and just say, you know what, it's so much information. I'm missing stuff. I can't take notes and listen. So I'm just going to listen. And therefore I don't have to take notes because I'm going to record it.
But you just have to
Totally.
let them know ahead of time.
Yep.
Okay. That's it. We were 3 minutes over. I
I know,
apologize.
that was good for us, really.
You guys did great. That was so much content and it was incredible. I can't thank you both enough. And thank you so much for putting your contact information on here. I haven't seen any additional questions come through since I last asked that one question. But I think you had mentioned this at the beginning. If anyone has specific questions or wanted to connect with you, that these would be the best way to do it. These contact info.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, excellent. Well, Lisa, Andrea, I really can't thank you enough. This was such a thoughtful and comprehensive presentation of some really valuable information, and I feel pretty confident in saying that everyone attending here is leaving with some more knowledge of the IEP process, which can be really daunting. So thank you
Yep.
for breaking it
Ho-
down. And
Hopefully their head isn't exploding.
Right.
Wow.
As we
I
just said,
am,
take some time to process it. And if you have questions later
yeah,
on, give us a call or email us.
exactly. Oh, perfect. Awesome. If anybody has any questions, feel free to pop that into the Q&A box. We can hang on here for another minute or so, if that works for both of you. And if you are headed out because it's the end of your evening here, feel free to do so. And we did get a question of, are the slides going to be accessible? I spoke with both of the presenters, felt comfortable in sharing them. So Verbal Beginnings will send out the recording of today's presentation along with the slides. So you will have access to those. Great question. Just pause here. We'll land at 6:05 and we can call it if no other questions come through. But thank you again, Lisa and Andrea.
Thank you. This was the first time for a virtual presentation for us, so it was.
You would never know it. It was so great. Question did come through is, do schools allow ABA therapists into the school?
Depends on, it depends. I've had ones that what I find is they'll let them come in and do like a consultative, like they'll let them come in, do an observation,
Or help with the transition.
consult with the team, certainly attend meetings. You can bring them to meetings because you're allowed to bring whoever you want to a meeting. Just let them know ahead of time. I generally don't see where if it's a private ABA, that the schools, they're not working, they would be hired by the school as a school system employee if they're going to be doing ABA regularly. It's not I want my ABA therapist to come in and work with my son or daughter during the school day.
Yeah, and I can add to this question because this is sort of within our wheelhouse on Verbal Beginning side. It really, and to add to what you guys had already said, it really is school system dependent too. Some school districts do take the initiative to have contracts with, organizations such as Verbal Beginnings, which, to what you had added before, sometimes that does look like a consult model. Sometimes they're more willing to let you come in and do, professional development with their teachers. And sometimes it does look like having a therapist coming. That's definitely more of a rare occasion, but seen it happen. But it never hurts to ask and to advocate for yourself,
Absolutely.
is what I've seen, and I'm sure both of you could probably agree to that. But yeah, if that's something of interest, I always tell parents that you're your child's best advocate.
And same with the BCBA. If you love your
Mhm.
BCBA and you want them to consult or you want them to come in and do an observation or observations, and they can be part of the team as well.
Absolutely, that's
Never
such a
hurts to
great
ask.
point.
Always put it in
Never
writing.
hurts to ask.
And
And
don't
just
forget
put
to
it
put it in writing while you're asking.
right.
Yes, yes, absolutely. All right, we are at 6:06, so I'll be respectful of everybody's time here. And I want to send a third, fourth thank you over to Andrea and Lisa for your time tonight. We hope to have you back here with some more great content in the future. So I will talk with you both soon. And everybody who was here today, thank you so much for attending. We hope to see you at some future webinars.